like to do is start by extending a warm welcome and thank you for joining our presentation today. My name is Tiffany Wood-Lysette, and I'm a school social worker with the Safe Schools and Wellbeing portfolio. You see a number of folks with their cameras on currently, and the first I'm going to ask to introduce themselves is Caitlin, and she'll introduce herself now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Those of you who are new, or those of us, I see some returning names as well, which always brings us some joy. As Tiffany mentioned, my name is Caitlin Chow. I have the opportunity to work with the Thames Valley District School Board as part of the Safe Schools and Wellbeing portfolio. My role involves this sort of project, as well as supporting a number of schools to help create safe learning environments.
So, Caitlin and I are both very excited to be a part of this collaboration between local school boards and community partner agencies to host these family well-being workshop presentations throughout the year with varying topics and presenters. And so, the slide that you can see before you just refers to a link for you that is clickable to our website where you can find the list of upcoming presentations. And before the conclusion of today's talk, we will provide more key information about contacts before we let you go. So, just before we introduce our speakers, the other thing you can see on this slide is the way in which we encourage our audience to communicate with us. We are in the Teams webinar version, and so that might be a little different than something you've experienced before. Along the top toolbar, and you can see a picture of it here in your slide, there's two speech bubbles, and below them it says Q ampersand A in the English alphabet. Should you have a question throughout the presentation or throughout the discussion today, we encourage you to use that function. And when you click on it, it will open an opportunity for you to type a question and submit it to us. We will hold those till the question and answer period of the seminar today. And if you find difficulty with that, depending on the version of Teams that you're joining us with, there will be an opportunity where Caitlin will release the microphones for participants and they can indicate their interest in raising their hand and asking a question. So we hope that you stay with us during that time or until that time if you have difficulty sending us a question before then. The other thing that we want to make you aware of is that this session is being recorded. And as such, we ask that you do not share your name or identifiers to protect your privacy if you do flip on your mic to ask a question. Um, in addition, if you have questions that are really specific to your family's unique needs, we want to let you know that we will provide you with contact information during the kind of conclusion of the presentation for private follow-up if that feels like it might be better suited to you. And so these are contacts and things that you can take a look at. And now I have the pleasure of beginning by introducing my colleague and manager, Lucas Andersen, who will then provide you an introduction to our speaker for today. Lucas Andersen is the manager of student mental health at the Thames Valley District School Board and actually also a part-time faculty member at King's University College within the social work department. Together with a team of passionate and brilliant-minded colleagues, I love it when he describes our team that way, Lucas supports schools on their journey to creating a safe and inclusive environment that promotes well-being and equity for all students. Lucas is really passionate about utilizing performance art to advocate for social justice, as well as finding innovative ways to engage students and families in transformative discussions surrounding mental health, well-being, and stigma reduction. Lucas is exceptionally grateful to have the opportunity to be with everyone this evening to discuss this meaningful topic that impacts all of our lives. So I would like to turn things over to Lucas and welcome you.
Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me all right? Can you hear me all right? Wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that introduction. It's always very interesting hearing your own bio read back to you. So I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here. And I'm excited to be a part of this webinar with all of our parents, our caregivers, our community members, our educators who are participating during the live event, and also those of you who are watching the recording. So as Tiffany had shared, my name is Lucas Andersen. I am a social worker and I'm at the TVDSB and I am the manager of student mental health. We are so fortunate to work in such a collaborative community. I'm very grateful for that. And the TVDSB greatly values our partnerships with BrainsCan to offer this learning opportunity. So BrainsCan is a neuroscience research initiative located at Western University that aims to transform the way brain diseases and disorders are understood, diagnosed, and treated. This event is part of an ongoing series to support bridging research practices research into practice. So that's really exciting. And it is really my pleasure to have a conversation with Dr. Emma Duerden, who is a Canada Research Chair in Neuroscience and Learning Disorders. So I just want to take a moment to welcome Emma. And Emma, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucas. And big thank you to Tiffany and Caitlin and to Laura for inviting me to present. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight.
All right. So we have all experienced and observed how COVID has negatively impacted the mental health and well-being of children and youth. Understanding its impact has been a focus of Emma's recent research, and today we will specifically be discussing the impact COVID has had on the amount of screen time for children and how this may be impacting their development. So we're going to get started with some questions, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Emma.
Yeah, great.
So, question number one here for us is, what is considered screen time?
Well, screen time is considered any time an individual is interacting with an electronic device. So this can include just watching television, using a smartphone, using a video game console. So probably a lot of the things that I'm talking about, people will think about how this is so integrated into our everyday lives. Screens are really everywhere, right? They're at work. They're used in classrooms. We even see them at the children's pediatrician office. So screens are really everywhere. What I'd note is that for screen time is that it's not all the same. So there are different types of screen time. So of course, one of the first things that we think of when we hear about screen time, we think, oh, watching television. And that's what we would think about more passive screen time, where you're just looking at a screen and not really doing anything else. Or we can also think about active screen time. So this is more for playing video games, playing with other friends in a group, but also using a screen. Then there's also communication, social media using Facebook, Instagram, and this is really a form of communication, even though it could be one-sided. There's also screen time related to, of course, e-learning or productivity. So going online to take a course, learn a new skill even. I think many of us did that during the pandemic, using YouTube to take guitar lessons, for example. And then really the last type of screen time would be using it for like things like creativity, drawing, creating art, but using digital means. So it's important to note that there are these different types of screen times, and we also have to think about the context that it's being accessed. So for example, if you are watching television at the gym while you're exercising, this is, very different from just sitting more sedentary on a couch. The other thing that I wanted to note is that screen time is often used to talk about, children and adolescents. When we think, oh, screen time, using screens, we often think immediately of children. But we also have to think for our own screen time as adults, and particularly for older adults, as there's becoming increasing awareness about screen time and how it's being used.
I really appreciate that very thorough definition. I guess I'm curious within the context of this topic, how much screen time is too much?
Well, it may be surprising for the people who are joining on the call today that there are guidelines that have been provided by the Canadian Pediatric Society. And those guidelines are very comparable to its American counterpart, to the international guidelines, even those set by the World Health Organization. And in fact, it's for infants and children, for infants and toddlers rather, so really under the age of 2 years, it's recommended that they have no screen time at all, apart from um, video chatting, for example, with a family member. Then for preschool age children, 2 to 5, it's recommended that those children get about 1 hour a day. And then from 5 to 18 years, it's recommended that children have 2 hours a day of screen time. So probably for most people here, that information may be a little surprising that there are these guidelines, and people may also think that they may be thinking that, oh, potentially their teen at home or their child at home may be getting more than that. And of course, screen time is very difficult to monitor. So these guidelines were developed by the Canadian Pediatric Society some time ago, and really more in the time of the 2000s, when we didn't really have access to anything beyond, television, essentially. And so they were revised recently, but really kind of staying in the same limits. So like none under 2, 1 hour between 2 to 5, and then 2 hours for 5 and over. But there's been certain changes about the context in which screen time is being accessed. So for example, if you're sitting down with your child and watching a program together, that's really considered to be like more of like a positive aspect of screen time. I'd also like to note that, just as I said that there's different types of screen time, is that the quality and the content of screen time, of course, varies. So, for example, Sesame Street. So I don't know how many children watch Sesame Street today, but I grew up with Sesame Street, and I mean, it won't be a shock to most people here is that was associated with learning. Like children did learn numbers and letters and spelling and that sort of thing. So high quality content that is directed towards children can have benefits, but there should be limits on screen time, because for interacting with screens, despite how they are everywhere, it can impact how it can limit children to do other healthy, positive behaviors that we know are essential for healthy development. So not just in terms of their physical health, but their cognitive health, their social health in terms of how they interact and make friends with others, and their mental health.
I really appreciate you sharing that, and I know you shared that it is that can be surprising for some folks to hear, because you're right. Screen time is so integrated into so many parts of our daily life. It's really interesting to hear about the specific guidelines that are impacting people, and it makes me think we've just been through a couple of very strange years in the middle of COVID, and I'm curious I'm curious to hear your perspective on how you feel COVID has impacted the amount of time children and youth are spending on screens.
Well, with the COVID-19 pandemic, so for most of us here who are living in Ontario, during the initial lockdown phases, during that time when schools were closed, there was a change to remote learning for some children, where their educational curriculum went online. Of course, for entertainment, watching movies, even recreation, right? For some families who were, maybe they were in a smaller apartment, for example, or living in, more of like an urban setting in a city, it wouldn't really be possible to kind of leave the house and, go to a park. Even at that time, the playgrounds were closed. So in turn, even doing online, recreation became very popular. Of course, we all stayed in touch through using different platforms to communicate, and we often relied, so much on screens. And then, overall, I mean, it's not a big surprise that, it was a massive amount of an increase in using screens. So for our group, we wanted to study this in children and families. So our group actually mainly does brain imaging studies, studying cognitive ability in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And during the pandemic, we couldn't do those studies, so we still wanted to connect with families. And we did kind of a broad survey, and we were asking, various different questions. But what we were most surprised about finding was the responses that the parents had to screen time. So we asked them, how much time does your child spend on screens, like watching television, watching movies, playing video games, YouTube? How much time did they spend on screens before the pandemic? And how much time are they spending on it right now? So because we released the study, it was right at the beginning of the initial 2020 lockdown. And we were quite shocked to find out. So this was school-age children, so 6 to 12. So we were quite shocked to find out that the children's screen time had nearly tripled during that time period. So before the pandemic, most children were following the original guidelines of about 2 hours a day. But in the pandemic period, it had gone up to almost 6 hours per day. And that was the average that they were reporting. Looking at the individual reports, some children were on screens for over 13 hours a day. And that was not including online learning. That was in addition to online learning. So in turn, although that was not the original focus of the survey, it was one of many questions. We became very interested in answering this question, and other groups around the world had also reported similar findings. And so during the pandemic, obviously this was a crisis time, right? I mean, there was really, limited access, and though communicating by screens and spending so much time on screens was, it was real absolute necessity. And depending on where people were living, they really didn't have they didn't have many choices. And so I would just also take the time to note that our group has since done a meta-analysis of 37 countries around the world. And we looked at the scientific research studies that had been reported during this time, so studies very similar to ours, to really do kind of an environmental scan. So this included countries, of course, Canada, United States, countries in Africa, included India, Australia, really all over the world, the Middle East. And what we found is that irrespective of of the setting they were in, high income, low income, high resource, low resource setting, the parents' socioeconomic status, we found that the reports of screen time were also, they were in every country, they had exceeded the screen time guidelines. And in particular, we found that for children under the age of 2 who aren't supposed to be receiving really any screen time, that none of the studies had reported that they were meeting guidelines. All of the very young children and toddlers were being exposed to screens. So this just really highlights that it wasn't just an issue. It wasn't an issue for families here. It wasn't in Ontario. Not just for Canada. We're talking about a worldwide issue that is, and then understanding the long-term effects of this in terms of how we're seeing it in schools, how children are behaving, in the classroom, is now becoming a paramount.
So I really appreciate you sharing that. And yeah, that's uh, tripling the amount. It sounds like quite a staggering amount of change. And I'm really curious to hear your perspective just on how is it that screen time affects children and youth?
Well, it's a complex question, but so we know from studies that were conducted before the pandemic that screen time, longitudinal brain imaging studies, so they followed children over time with like repeated MRI scans and allowed them to look at their children's brains, that this was associated with changes, particularly in a part of our brain that is responsible for kind of very broadly executive functions. So monitoring, planning, like memory abilities, all the things that we really need for success at school. So in addition to that study, before the pandemic, we know as well, I mean, it's not a surprise to say that it's associated with changes in physical health, right? So for the most part, if people are doing kind of passive screen time, or even active screen time. They're not going to be moving. They're sitting in a chair, so there can be great amounts of sedentary behaviors. This can impact cardiovascular health, body mass index. And then also it can significantly impact children's sleep. So it's really recommended that children avoid screens about 1 hour before bedtime because it can impact their sleep. And of course, if children don't sleep, then they're not going to be very happy. So in addition to the brain imaging study that I had mentioned about about the brain imaging study and like the changes in brain regions responsible for monitoring, planning, and memory, there's been other studies to demonstrate that it is associated, with those changes in behavior in terms of children's ability to attend. There's also studies in young children to suggest that excessive screen time can be associated with delayed language. So, of course, language is something, it's a two-way street, right? To learn language is important to have input. As very young children are learning language, they're looking at, looking at facial expressions and cues. They're learning, like their parents are pointing to like certain objects and like telling them, oh, like what's, the name of these objects, right? This is, so essential, so simple, right, for early learning. But that really is not the same if it's coming from a screen. Like children need to have, they need to have they need to attend and need to be, have that input. Additional concern is around children's social development and excessive amounts of screen time. In addition to the other studies that we conducted, we've also been following a group of 200 families since November of 2020. And so we actually just finished our 8th time point recently. So we've been following them for over 2.5 years. And what we found is that screen time has really remained unchanged in that it is not as high as it was in the initial periods, but it's also it has continued to remain significantly high and double that of the guidelines that are set by the Canadian Pediatric Society. And for our study, we found that one of the significant changes over time was that for children who had been watching screens for more than 7 hours a day, where they saw with the greatest amount of change was in their pro-social behaviors. So they had less pro-social behaviors towards others. And so we can't say there's, causation here. So we can't say, oh, if a child looks at a screen, it's going to impact their social ability. But it was the excessive screen time. So we can just infer that, if a child is spending over 7 hours a day on a screen, then, chances are their social communication, interacting with others, that's going to be limited. Interacting with others is a skill that we build. You have to practice it, right? So it's like, learning a musical instrument. And another concern for children is in terms of their mental health. So there was studies conducted during the pandemic which focused on children's mental health and screens. And unfortunately, children who were exposed to high levels of screen time also reported higher levels of depression and anxiety, as well as lower self-esteem. Outside of the pandemic, we know that exposure to things like social media can certainly impact self-image, body image, and in turn, children's self-esteem. So this is something that children will build more in adolescence, but by having this, repeated, exposure, repeated imagery, especially in high volumes, certainly having it, a small, like regulated amount isn't really associated with these changes. But when we're seeing that children are on screens, for, more than, 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day, and if they're spending that time on social media, it can certainly impact self-image and body image. And then lastly, more broadly, increased screen time is associated with behavioral issues. So I don't think that would be a surprise maybe to this group in terms of, seeing a lot of behavioral changes. For things like video games or even for YouTube videos where they're very rapid, children are getting like high amounts of kind of constant feedback and reward. And, really, we're not designed so much, for that as humans, right? To kind of like process all that reward and always be expecting change, very, very quickly. And so, and just as I said before, it's not like it's fine if it's, if it's for small amounts, but if we're seeing, excessive exposure to that, that's when we can see a number of different changes. And then it can, be seen in children's behavior. So in terms of, difficulties with attention, but then being impulsive or even aggressive behaviors.
Well, I'm curious. So I'm curious if you have anything else that you want to share. I'm particularly interested, just really related to the mental health and well-being of children and youth. So is there any additional information that you have? And if not, I am also really curious to hear about, sort of what are executive functioning skills. I hear about them in the context of this when we're talking about screen time and when we're talking about building executive functioning skills for our students. I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so just for the first question about, for mental health and anxiety. So clearly during the pandemic period, there was many things that were going on, more than just, watching screens, right? I mean, it was a very challenging time for everyone, for children, for their families, for their parents. So I'd also note in our studies that we had very high levels of parent stress. And in fact, the higher stress levels of the parents actually predicted children's screen time. So those parents who were more stressed, their children were kind of more likely to spend time on screens. So we didn't ask exactly, what, about that relationship, but potentially parents who were stressed more, they had to, work more, they, their job doubled, the amount of work that they had to do was online, and in turn it doubled. For some people, that was the reality, not for everybody. And so, maybe those children, they had to spend, more time on screens because they didn't have, their parents around. So, for whatever reason, just to say that, that we can't, when we think about, a children and a screen at home, it's more than that, right? It's also about the family as well. But it's important for us to, to understand these associations and these relationships, and to really be able to understand how screen time is affecting children's mental health, and ways to support it. For the second part about executive functions, so executive functions are things like attention and focus, being able to sit in the classroom, being able to, sit through their school lessons, for a considerable amount of time. Working memory is another aspect of executive function. So when I say working memory, this is more like short-term memory. So very broadly in our brains, we have two memory systems. We have short-term memory and long-term memory. And short-term memory is something like 30 seconds up to a couple of minutes. And that information is then transferred to long-term memory. So, when we're very stressed, for example, it can be sometimes, you can't remember things, right? And that's because we have these two different systems which can kind of operate separately. So for children, for children, or when they're learning, they're taking information from working memory and they're putting it into long-term memory. Another aspect of executive functions is the ability to inhibit responses or to manage impulsivity, right? Like, talking out of turn. When I say inhibition, this is, the ability to kind of like stop a response. So let's say that you're really scared of snakes, for example, and then you see a toy plastic snake on the floor, which can, kind of look real. You're probably not gonna, like, run out of the room, right? Because you're gonna say, "Wait a minute, is that a real snake? Like, why am I seeing a snake here?" Right? Like, at home in, in Canada, right? So and that's your prefrontal cortex, what I talked about before, that puts the brakes on the rest of your brain that says, wait a minute, like, let's take a closer look here. And so also, when we're stressed, right? And if we think about if if there's like an emergency or something like that, you think there's a fire, you're immediately going to run out of the room, right? And then people will ask you like, well, what did you do? You're like, oh, well, I couldn't think. And that's actually because that's when in a situation of, high stress, high anxiety, your prefrontal cortex lifts off the brake, and then the other parts of your primordial brain, like the fight or flight, like run away, that is like ready to go, all the time. That's also parts of like our brain responsible for aggression. So that, prefrontal cortex, that inhibition is, really important to, for that, like that planning, the monitoring, the thinking. Another key aspect of executive function includes problem solving and critical thinking, and then also just being kind of mentally flexible, being able to switch from, one task to another, and, being able to kind of start doing one thing, like playing at recess, and then kind of stop that and be able to like go and sit in a classroom, or, switch from, two tasks, to switch quite quickly between two different tasks.
I appreciate you sharing that, and definitely, in our own schools and through the work that we do, we see how important those executive functioning skills are for our children as they're developing through school. And we also have seen quite significantly how the pandemic, how COVID has really impacted and changed that as well too for a lot of our folks. And so I am really curious, just from your perspective, what are some of those signs for all of our parents and caregivers out there? What are some of those signs that a child may be really struggling with executive functioning? What should we be watching out for?
Well, it's complex because, children, like what you would say for a young child would be, different for a teenager, right? So one thing, for example, is difficulties with managing times, or schedules. So like not really kind of planning very well on how long something is going to take. It can also be, running late often, not being able to just to manage time. So in a young child, that's pretty common, right? Like this is, something that we learn when we get older. So it could be something more that we see for older children. In general, just being, disorganized, misplacing things, misplacing belongings, disorganization in, children's rooms, which of course is probably, across the board. But right, they should be getting better, right, at that, like as they get older. And then, difficulties with planning things, having to put together their day, what they need to do, and how they have to organize it. Also, I had mentioned this before, just kind of difficulties with attention, being distracted very easily, not being able to focus, and then difficulties with like that, putting those brakes on, difficulties with being, impulsive, talking out of turn, and just overall acting without thinking, without kind of like, saying, okay, just like taking a step and then planning things. And then also just what I mentioned previously, just about like the being mentally flexible. So for some children who can have difficulties with executive function, we can see this in, being like very rigid, being like unable to change, unable to, adapt to change or schedules, becoming very irritated and irritable.
This has been, just really valuable information, just sort of understanding how screen time has affected, our children and our youth and adults as well too, and also to some of the pieces that we should be looking out for. And I'm really curious at this point in time if you might be able to focus the conversation for us on, for all of our families out there, what can they do to support their child's development in this area?
Well, there's a number of things that families can do, and they probably already are doing. So, for example, just having routines at home, like having predictable times for waking up, times for going to school, times for doing homework, time, bedtime, just having that predictable schedule for children, really for all children. This is extremely helpful, just so they can predict, and then it can also in turn help them to manage their time. So in terms of if a child is having difficulty with kind of like that planning and time management and that sort of thing, by having a little, having a schedule laid out for them during the day, that can be great modeling behavior for parents to kind of to show them like, oh, when we have something very complex to plan, you can, make a schedule. For children who can have, difficulty with organization and planning, it can be helpful to break things down into smaller tasks. So for adults, we can think of something, very simple, like putting school bags, yes, like everything that child needs for school into their school bag. People can, think of this as being, such a small task, right? But then it can be that there has to be many things that have to, go in for the next day, for example, for whatever activities they're going to be doing in addition to their schoolwork. So really, breaking it down into very small components and saying, can do this step, this step, this step, and this step. And that can often help, particularly for children who are having difficulties with that working memory piece, right? So if a child is having difficulties with executive functions and with working memory, then if you can ask them to do a long list of tasks, then they're not going to be able to remember. Then they're going to be frustrated, and then they can be angry. So breaking it down into small tasks. For young children in particular, having like little visual aids, and we can see this in schools where what children have to do. Like when they come in, especially in wintertime, they have all those different steps what they have to do, like take off their mittens and their snow pants, like, and that has to be done in a particular order. So having those little visual aids at home, that can also be very helpful, just to promote those planning skills and to kind of trigger working memory. And then just having any external cues, reminders that can help children throughout the day. Another thing that parents can really support is supporting children, to have a break, take time, take a breather. They can also, really promote self-regulation skills. So the prefrontal cortex is, for example, really important for self-regulation, and things like mindfulness, meditation, or other types of that, breathing activities. Because this can actually really help to promote self-regulation. There's also lots of children's books about reporting, about self-regulation, and really trying to encourage those skills in children. So if they start to, get frustrated, they are start to activate like that fight or flight response. They can, if they have the tools to be able to self-regulate. And sometimes, that's not going to be something that a child can do, in 1 minute or 10 minutes. Sometimes it takes a long time for children to cool down. It can be that they need to have a routine, around that, like to promote self-regulation skills, like having some type of like calming activity that they do that allows them to kind of to calm down, and that's going to really promote that prefrontal cortex, the planning and the monitoring. And I think another really important aspect, which is maybe underlooked, is promoting physical activity and exercise. So there is a wealth of information on how physical activity even short bouts of physical activity, how this can promote activation in the brain in the prefrontal cortex, and how it can be associated with improved attention and focus in children. And some schools, they even really promote having regular physical activity during the day, because we know about the benefits. And then also, of course, families can just promote um, teaching their child problem solving skills, practicing this, practicing scheduling even a small task, like, growing grocery shopping, breaking it down into small tasks, and then giving children those skills in terms of how to plan and monitor, opposed to taking children and, taking them on, these types of tasks, but not engaging them. So I think all of those factors can really help to promote executive functions in children.
Really appreciate that. That's a wide breadth of opportunities and things that families can be doing. And I'm thinking, for all of our parents and caregivers that are out there in our audience today, we are going to be shortly coming to a Q&A period where we're going to be able to hear from you. So I hope as you're hearing this from Emma, you can really start to think about, are there any questions that you have on how to be able to implement some of these skills, or any other questions you might have related to what Emma has been sharing. But as we're moving through, I am really curious. I want to know, as educators, what can educators do to address this developmental gap for children and youth? So in our schools, what is it that we can be doing to support our youth?
Yeah, and I think this is an important issue, particularly in the post-pandemic period, as children are returning to classrooms. So, like those skills that I was talking about previously, like those executive skills, teaching students planning, organization, the self-regulation pieces for problem solving, goal setting, just as it can be done at home, it can also be done in classroom settings. For children who may be struggling more than others, by breaking down those tasks, providing really clear instruction, getting, any other types of visual supports, just like at home, doing things like with multimodal learning in a few different aspects, to really promote retention. And I think it's also important in terms of breaking tasks down, teaching study skills to children, and the things that I had mentioned about promoting self-regulation. This can often be done in classrooms as well. It's also, working with and then it won't be a surprise to educators, just the importance of working with families. Oftentimes what they're seeing in the classroom is what people are seeing at home, and working as a team together, identifying what are the factors that are, happening maybe at home or at school that can be, to better understand children's behaviors, and then having a set plan for teachers and parents at home, and how it can be implemented and carried out. And then just, these changes, they don't happen overnight, right? It can, it can take a long time. Oftentimes for school-based interventions, any type of school-based interventions, for whether it be for bullying or to promote self-regulation, these skills, these are often implemented over the entire school year. So months and months and months. So just to say that it can't be just once, and it can't just be necessarily, just at home or just at school, in that it really takes a community to be able to support children.
I really appreciate that. I really hear this idea that it really takes an integrated approach, and that there is a role for families and there's a role for schools to be playing and able to address some of the impacts of screen times for our children and youth. I really appreciate you sharing that. You know, I have many, many questions in my head that I would want to ask you, and I'm curious. Before we're switching over to asking some of our audience members at all, um, what questions they may have, and they may want to hear from you. Is there anything else that you felt it was important to share about screen time? And I'm sure is a whole lot, but I just wanted to pass it to you one last time before we turn to our audience.
Yeah, so, I would just wanted to reiterate that screen time is complex. It's not something we can study in a laboratory, right? Because screens are around us, they're everywhere, and they're not going away. So, and in fact, for probably most children, as they get older, they're going to be spending a lot of time in front of a screen if when they go to university or when they're working. It is part of our everyday lives. At the same time, it's important to be aware and really just to be monitoring children's screen time, especially if it can be related to if parents think that it might be related to behavioral issues. It's important to not only to monitor children's screen time, but a few different tips that can be very helpful is just at home to have screen-free zones. There's parts, for example, in children's bedrooms to not have the habit where children are watching screens alone without that, parental presence, and also to be able to particularly monitor screen time before bed. And that children should be avoiding screens by about 1 hour before they go to sleep. And overall, we know that the pandemic has had so many effects on children and families. The screen time issue has become, clearly increasingly important, which I highlighted with our meta-analysis from studies, well over 100 studies in 37 countries around the world, that clearly this is a global public health issue. And in fact, for most parents or grandparents that you speak to, they may be unaware that there are these guidelines, and that it is an important public health issue for children and for their families, particularly in the context where we know that it can be associated with alterations in brain development, in how children are going to do later on at school, and how they're going to be actually interacting socially.
I really want to thank you for that and for providing that summary. And yeah, it gives you a lot to think about, just when you think about your daily life practices, both for children and youth. As a parent, I can definitely see that for myself as well too, but I also think for us as adults as well too in our own practices. So I really appreciate you sharing. I want to take an opportunity to see if we have any questions coming from our audience here about things you might want to hear about.
We don't at this time, so just a reminder to everybody that you are more than welcome to post questions in the Q&A function. That helps us just to be able to work through them as they come in. And I can also, if Tiffany's okay with it, I can release the microphone should anyone not be able to access that. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to remind folks, especially if they prefer to use the Q&A, we know that a number of people joined when they could. And it's not lost on me that we're currently on a screen. Like that part's not lost on me in this presentation to our audience. And so if folks feel more comfortable communicating using the Q&A and you came a little later, it's just along the top toolbar. And then you could submit your question that way. However, we have a participant already who's put their hand up and knows how to use that piece. And so it looks like you've turned the mics on. And go ahead, Caitlin.
You can go ahead for that first participant.
Eating their lunch.
So should I take well, so I'm not with the school board, but I'm in the faculty of education at Western University. So for the screen time, for whether it's, sitting at a meal or if it's, first thing in the morning, that sort of thing. So it's really about the amount of time that the children are spent on screens. So So during the pandemic, I think, and children returned to classrooms, for example, they were encouraged like not to get up and to move around, for example, like just to limit the spread of the infection. So potentially there, maybe watching screens, at lunchtime was really, maybe necessary, particularly for very young children, right? It was very difficult to get them to sit. So if children are having a little bit of screen time, at lunchtime, then that can count towards their total essentially. So it's just important for parents to be aware of that. Because parents may think, oh, they're not getting any screen time, whatsoever, and then coming home having 2 hours, but they may have had a small amount of exposure to screens at school as well. So that's, important information. Yeah, I think, for like communicating that information, for both like the schools or for parents, just, asking about asking about their child's day when they get the opportunity at parent-teacher interviews, certainly. Yeah, and I also wanted to note that in the pandemic, that school communication was actually a really important contributing factor in terms of parents' overall mental health and well-being. So that any type, but the school communication, and so not just like for like their child's day, but about the homework and that sort of thing. So certainly everybody has a part to play.
Thank you for
Thanks very
that.
much.
And then our next participant whose first letter starts with letter J.
Because I think for most educators here on the line, they would notice that, let's say when children return to school, in September after they've had the summer, that there can be like that summer slide, right? In terms of all the information that they seem to have from last year seems to be, kind of, out the window. And it can take time, to kind of for relearning. The other, and when we first had our studies at the initial phases of the lockdown, when speaking, about the media that promoted the studies, sometimes people would say, well, it's just a crisis time, right? So we're just talking about, screen time for, a couple of months, right? But for the studies now, we've been following families, for almost 3 years, so we can see that this is not just it's not just a couple of months or a couple of weeks, right? This is now years. So in terms of whether the changes, can be reversible, we really at this point don't know. Certainly for in times where children, for example, weren't able to attend school in the past, and they were at home. This was in the case of exposure to war or something, that actually it can take a really long time for children to kind of get back to where they were. So for 3 months lost of schooling, this can equate to almost a year and a half of needing to get back to where they were after. So in terms of the exposure to screens, in terms of like cutting back on screen time and promoting things like healthy brain development, we do know that certain like and for taking up like exercise, we do know that this can have effects on the brain, like not immediately, but we do know that these types of interventions are very, very important and can lead to brain changes. The other thing that I wanted to note is that it was initially thought about, 20 years ago, that children's brains developed, and then when we became adults, that our brains were all fixed and done, and that didn't change. But that's not true at all. Our brains are always changing. They're always developing, even like 70s and 80 years of age, that our brains are highly plastic and they can change. So I wouldn't say that it would be certainly not an immediate change. It would be something that could be seen over months or over years.
Thank you. That was an excellent question as well.
Thank you.
I don't see anything in the Q&A. I invite other people to come forward if you have questions. We have such wonderful knowledge and expertise in our hands here. Oh, and we have another participant. Go ahead.
So just while
And
we're waiting, Emma, would you be able to just explain? I'd posted this slide a little bit earlier on for a little while for folks, just as a opportunity to learn a little bit more about Western brain scan. So it's up there now. If you have a chance to just sort of describe, like, who would they be contacting and how would this be relatable for the audience?
Yes, so our brain scan, anybody can participate in research. Some of the studies are online or some of the studies are at the university. So if you wanted to do a brain imaging study and have an MRI scan, then you can sign up. You can put your name into a participant pool. And then if any studies that come up that are interesting, then you'll get an email. So you'll kind of be ahead of the game. So you won't have to always be searching for, where can you do a research study. So you can go to the website, you can sign up, you can see all the studies that are available. So you can sign up for specific studies and you have the option to kind of like keep your name in the pool. And then you can get signed up. So it's true for children as well. So we do studies with babies, children, adolescents, older adults. And these studies are going on all the time. So if you're interested, you can sign up, and then if you're not interested to participate anymore, then you can remove your information, remove your name. But it's been really great opportunity for us. We recruit a lot of children from our studies using our brain scan, and it's really been wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
It's really cool.
Yeah, and
while we're waiting, oh, go
I was
ahead.
going to say that people can, my email is up there as well, so people are welcome to email me as well after this webinar.
Wonderful. And the other thing that participants should know is that in this version of Teams, if they take their cursor and hover over your email or the website, it's actually a clickable link. It will open a window in another browser. So this is a live slide that anyone can click on in order to access those pieces of contact information right now. Just
All
want to give
right.
space and time in case there's no other Q&A, there's no other hands up.
Yeah,
Love
that's
that
a great.
question.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because it's about managing. So, developing having screen-free times at home, for like the 5 to 7 is a popular one, right? Like for dinner time, and where everyone is off screen. So, modeling the behavior that you want to see in your children. So sometimes it can be do as I say, but not as I do. Like they'll tell you to go play outside while you're on your phone. Being able just to model the type of behavior that you want to see, have times of day, maybe when there's no screens, in the morning, or just limiting screen time to be at certain times. This can help to just as a gradual way. And then engaging children, explaining about screen time, monitoring their behaviors themselves, and to monitor that screen time and to track it. Well, for self-regulation skills, there are programs that have even been developed for children who are 4 years of age. So, and this can focus on things like mindfulness. So just being aware, the present moment, and these types of things are often quite easy for children to understand. When they're eating, they're eating. When they're if they're reading a book, then they're reading a book. They're not thinking about doing chores, or they're not thinking about playing soccer tomorrow. And just that kind of, it's about really the everyday in terms of, promoting those kind of simple things that can really help to help children focus and attend. Even it can only start out just for, us, like a short amount of time, right? So for a 6-year-old, 10 minutes would be an eternity, right? But even just the simple thing of, just, focus on eating when you're eating and not thinking about doing other things. Kind of those simple things can really, and promoting mindfulness and those kind of everyday practices can help children with their self-regulation skills. Screen time. It's a great suggestion that you mentioned about the community supports as well, like going, like attending the library, boys and girls clubs, many of these things, they can be accessible for most in the community. For some families, they may not be able to access those resources, but certainly those are all really fantastic suggestions. Thank you so much. Yeah, you know what? That's a really great question, and nobody did ask it before. Yeah, like the part about like spending time and watching screens with your children. So you don't necessarily have to interact with them at the time, right? Like, let's say it was, something with a song, like something you could sing along with, but you could also just use it as an opportunity to have a conversation about it afterwards. Like if you don't feel that it's, appropriate at the time, you at the end, you can talk about, what happened, promoting that, those memory skills, right? Like, oh, what happened, and who was your favorite character, those sorts of things can really help just to engage in like the social discussion. It can be more than in the show itself, because of course you're right, it can be distracting for a young child. So you can watch the show together, you can talk about it in advance, watch the show, and then have the opportunity to talk about it after, and then maybe plan to watch it again together at another time.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Dr. Emma, as I hear other audience members self-reflecting, I too self-reflect and think, oh goodness, it didn't take one single day to get to a place where my own children were consuming a lot more screen time than had ever before. And so that's the other thing that I would just encourage like caregivers either live with us here or even into the future viewing this recording is that, making a plan to return to a space and time where the routines are more consistent in line with the guidelines, and then taking small steps each day or each week back to a space where you feel that there is more balance. Um, I heard you say clearly a very hopeful statement, and that is our brains are always changing. They're always growing. And so that's very hopeful that even if we find ourselves in a space after this last 3 years that is way in excess of what we have ever been used to before, that we can take those small steps and really be gentle, and move back toward a space where things are more in balance and we are getting to nature and we are getting active and we are doing those things. So hopefully that's also a message that our caregivers can take with us. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on those small steps and taking it slow and gentle to get us
Yeah.
back to a place where we want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, it's been a real gradual return, right? Like I think for us here in Ontario, it's been a gradual return back to, children's field trips are happening again, through the school. They're able to, engage in sports. They're able to do, things like that. They even last summer, that there were still many things that weren't being offered for children. So we've slowly being these things, starting to open up, and so there can be opportunities to start to, change some habits. for, you know, the studies that we did, and for my comments on screen time, is really just more for awareness about screens. As you know, we often think of it being, you know, innocuous. We think of it as, you know, for myself, you know, growing up, I had television, but you know, I grew up, you know, in Canada, so we didn't have, you know, we just had like two channels, right? Like growing up, we didn't have you know, iPads and cell phones and smartwatches, and you know, I mean, yeah, we had video games, but there, you know, for television was really not seen, or any screen time was when I was growing up, you know, it wasn't as much of a part of everyday life. So it has changed. It has changed so much from the generation today to the our children's generation. So just the information, to, you know, to have the awareness, you know, to think, well, you know, for these, you know, maybe difficulties at school, behavioral issues, could this be, you know, maybe related to something like screens, right? So just really, it's the everyday, right? It's making those everyday changes about, you know, like small steps, you know, maybe making new routines, and how that can really help just to, I mean, obviously we're not going to end screen time. It's not going to, you know, happen anytime soon. So, but just to monitor it, and to be aware of the effects of screen time. And those are both fantastic questions. So for the first question about you know, YouTube, so you know, it would be considered, you know, like watching a screen, like watching drawing. So it is kind of learning as well, but really about like depending on the age of your child, just like, you know, trying to stay within those guidelines. And also, if you can, you know, be present at the time, you know, to be engaged. Maybe there's something about the drawing that could be done offline, that could be done together, for example. So clearly, if it's something that is, you know, an interest of your child, then maybe it can be something that's, you know, promoted offline, and to, you know, to do both, right? The question about the video games and whether there's benefits, this is a fantastic question, and it is a really active area of research and debate, with some research demonstrating that video games can be associated with improved motor abilities like reflexes, and that it can be associated with improved abilities like in terms of like those executive functioning skills that I was talking about. But there is other research to suggest the opposite. So I think it's a complex question, because obviously not all video games are the same, right? I mean, there's so many different video games, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So it's really kind of difficult to say, like, what would it be about, you know, a particular game that would be associated with, you know, like a specific benefit. So it's, you know, it's very challenging to do and to study, because children will, it's you know, that you kind of ask, you ask about what games, you know, children are playing, right? So I'm not aware of any research that's like, you know, specifically focused on giving children access to a particular video game, and then kind of, you know, tracking them over time. So it's an interesting question, and I think the idea, you know, playing video games, like doing it in a social setting with others, I think that can also be, you know, have a lot of benefit, and it's more of like an active screen time, you know, where you're actively participating and engaging with others. So there's a number of different benefits there that can have, you know, important trickle down effects into like children's you know, working memory and how they're socializing with others. So it goes back to that not all screen time is created equal, but really, so the answer is complex on the video game one.
Thank you. Very appreciate. Thanks.
And then another participant has their hand up.
Brittany, that's an excellent question, and it has been a focus of research. So certainly investigators have focused on this to determine whether using violent video games is associated with later violent behavior. And actually, so the short answer is that it's not. So it's often seen that for individuals who commit violent acts, they can often ask, oh, did they play video games? And they, it's like, oh, they were playing video games. So, but if you look at like on a population of like the, thousands of people who are playing video games and the ones that, that they engage in these like very unfortunate violent behaviors, there's actually no association.
I
Do you have
have
anything?
just,
Oh yeah,
oh,
go ahead, Caitlin.
no, that's okay. Just since we're on this idea of, oh, and actually, I just got another question, so hold mine. We have someone asking, during the screen time studies, were steps taken to rule out other possible conditions that could lead to these results? Some of the symptoms described, for example, the inability to focus or pay attention, difficulty organizing or social challenges, etc., sound very similar to ADHD.
Yes. Yes, no, that's a really great question. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is very common. It's 5% of children. So this is like 1 in 20 children. So it is very common. It can just be difficulties with attending. It can be difficulties with like that inhibition I was talking about earlier. So like not being able to kind of put the brakes down. So in our studies, we actually did collect information about neurodevelopmental disorders, and we did ask questions about that. Certainly, for the other studies that we did like looking at across studies, they may not have included that information. So they can also include typically developing children, but we know how common ADHD is, that some children can even be sub-threshold, right? So it is possible. It's a great question because it is possible that there was like sub-threshold ADHD children included, for example. But I would also say that despite that, we can really look at, this very large body of literature, not just our studies, but studies published before the pandemic, and studies that have been published now. So, hundreds of studies which have shown this, that children can be at risk. And certainly children with neurodevelopmental disorders are also, they're also at high risk as well. And some studies during the pandemic did focus specifically on those children as well. And also kind of reported, similar results about difficulties with executive function, but also mental health. That's a great question. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that. I'm curious there, when you mentioned that idea of certain neurodevelopmental components like ADHD perhaps, and having students or children be more at risk, when you talk about that, Dr. Emma, was it in relation to, so for example, if there's a child or a student who has ADHD, would you say that the screen time has a higher impact on them? Like, does it lead to more difficulties for a child who has ADHD versus one who doesn't?
You know what? That's an excellent question. I don't know of research that has, specifically compared children with neurodevelopmental disorders relative to children who, don't have ADHD. So when thinking about it though, I mean, if we're thinking that, screen time can impact children's brain development, and for example, children with ADHD, they can often have delayed development of the prefrontal cortex, so the region of the brain that's, those breaks. And for many children, they're delayed, they can be delayed about 2 years. So ADHD is prevalent in 5% of the general child population, but it's in 2% in adults. So children, as their brain is maturing, they have kind of maybe a 2-year lag where their prefrontal cortex needs extra time to develop, and they can, develop those skills. So already we kind of know that children with ADHD have they can have a slight delay in the development of their frontal lobes. And if the screen time is impacting the prefrontal cortex, which we know in children without ADHD, then to, infer that they could be at greater risk, I think is probable. But I really don't know of any research that, that has done that, but it could be likely that they would be at greater risk.
Thank you. And then I think we've got time for this last participant question.
Yeah, that's a really good point about reading online, reading in digital books, for example, on like a Kindle reader, for example, or on looking at a book on an iPad. And for oftentimes these books, they can be a little more captivating, right? Like with colors or with the images, and also it can be sometimes like a little more engaging for children in that they can touch the screens, for example. So so reading from books, having like from paper books, and spending time for parents, reading to their children. This, is associated with improved reading skills. We know that's having that also that time together. That's often at the time at bedtime, when we want to avoid the exposure to screens as well. So having those paper books, and to kind of, to have it at a time, reading together is important. In the future, I think whether or not in the future we're going to have more and more digital books. I mean, it's in some ways it's becoming, just kind of part of the future, right? And we need to, be aware of this, and that, having access to books and digital books is possible. I think for some families, they may not have access, to go to the library. Books can also be expensive, difficult to obtain. Of course, most schools have libraries, and that's, a fantastic program. So some parents may need to rely more on digital books, or, digital types of screens than others. And just to say that, even if that is happening, that, to do it in the context of reading together, right? As an opportunity to be able to comment on the material, and do, all of those things that you would do even if it was a regular book.
Thank you for that. And
That's a
I
great
will also
question.
just, yeah, absolutely. And I will also just add, in the context of like the education world, when we talk about digital literacy, sometimes that can, especially the word literacy, we often associate with books and readings and things like that. In terms of digital literacy in the curriculum, we're also looking at that understanding of how to use technology wisely. So it's not just this idea that all of a sudden we're only going to be on technology, but it's giving skills to children and to students to be able to know, when I'm on the internet, what is safe, what isn't, when I'm using my phone or social media, what's safe and what isn't. So digital literacy can take on a really broad range of skills beyond just reading in a digital format. So just a little piece there. And we will take that last question and then we will wrap up.
Question. So the short answer is no. So ADHD is a spectrum. It's a complex disorder. It's partially genetic. So we know from studies that it can run in families, for example, and we know it is associated with delayed brain development. So, which is complex. So, given that it is due to a number of different factors, it is unlikely to be due to something like excessive screen time. Screen time is an environmental factor, and maybe it can, what we said before about it could, children who have ADHD, could be at greater risk, for the, difficulties with, the cognitive ability, academic performance, who are exposed, but it is not a risk factor for developing ADHD or any other type of neurodevelopmental disorders. Although the behaviors can seem the same, it would be a different disorder. But thank you so much for that great question.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.
This has been really wonderful. I have learned so much. It has been so nice having you here, and I just want to express a lot of gratitude for your willingness to be here, to be interviewed, to be able to speak about this topic. We really appreciate it. And I will also pass it off to Tiffany here to close us off as well too.
Absolutely. And Dr. Duerden, thank you so much for lending your knowledge and expertise to our audience today. The amount of clarity you just provided in some of those questions and answers was so helpful and so valuable to help caregivers make informed decisions. So thank you so much for kind of being willing to join us, share your research and your information, and also be open to those audience question and answers, which have proven to be really rich and really interested and invested caregivers. So we are also so very grateful to the UWO team and BrainScan team for your collaboration to bring this discussion to our community as well. And just before we finish up, we also want to give a shout out and a big thank you to our audience who has joined us today. If you take a look at this slide with contact information, the other thing we would like you to know is that in the coming weeks, we will complete a recording, an edited recording, and share that back and be able to post that on our website. But just to remind the audience, should you wish to contact Dr. Emma or take a look at the website that's listed on the slide, or even if you'd like to send more specific or particular questions to myself or to Caitlin, who's been here on the call, we really encourage you to do so. And if you have questions about our project overall, with these family wellbeing caregiver series of webinars, then there is a link at the very bottom of this slide for you to sign up either for our mailing list, to contact us through the website, to take a look at previous recordings or upcoming webinars and presentations. And if we could graciously ask our audience, who's been with us for a while at this point, to take a look at the slide as well. And if you have a couple of minutes to provide your feedback to us using the link that's listed there about this presentation. This is really valuable and helps us be able to just continue to improve and develop kind of responses that meet the needs of our community. So if you could do that for us, we'd really, really appreciate it. And again, if you'd like to visit our website where you can find more information, then we encourage you to do so. And to conclude, thank you to everyone again. We wish you well on the rest of your travels today. Have a great day, have a great night, and take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.